My name is Emily, and before we dive into this story, let me just say that life doesn't always go the way you expect. Sometimes the people who come into your life aren't there to follow society's rules, and sometimes you find yourself caught in emotions you never knew existed. That's exactly what happened to me. When I look back on this now, I'm not proud of it, but it shaped who I am today. I wasn't prepared for how one decision could lead to a cascade of secrets, confusion, and guilt. And to make things even more complicated, it was with someone I could never admit my feelings for, my elder brother. Let me explain before you jump to conclusions. I grew up in a family that wasn't particularly close. We were polite, yes, but not overly warm. My brother, Daniel, was 5 years older than me. For most of my life, we were in completely different worlds. He was off to college when I was just starting high school, and by the time I graduated, he was already building his career. We rarely interacted beyond the occasional family gatherings, and even then, our conversations were polite but distant. But when I came back home after college, something shifted. Daniel wasn't the same person I remembered. He had grown into someone confident, accomplished, and surprisingly charming. Suddenly, he wasn't just my elder brother anymore. At first, I thought I was imagining things. How could I be so drawn to someone I'd known my entire life? But the feeling was there, undeniable and unshakable. One evening, we were sitting in the backyard under the stars, just talking. It started innocently enough, reminiscing about childhood memories and teasing each other about the silly things we used to do. But then he said something that stopped me cold. "You've really grown up, Emily," he said softly. "It's strange to see you as more than my little sister now." I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing, and not in the way it should have been. I laughed nervously and tried to change the subject, but his words lingered in the air between us. That was the beginning. What Daniel said that night was innocent enough, but it opened a door I couldn't close. Over the next few weeks, things only got more complicated. I started noticing feelings I had no business feeling. After that night under the stars, I tried to convince myself that his words meant nothing, that he was just being kind, maybe sentimental. But deep down, I couldn't shake the way he looked at me, like I was someone more than his little sister. I busied myself with life, job applications, friends, anything to keep my mind occupied. But somehow, Daniel always found a way to be around. He'd strike up conversations in the kitchen, linger in the living room while I worked, and sit a little too close when we watched TV. And I let him. At first, I told myself I was overthinking it. Families are supposed to stay close, right? But this wasn't just closeness, it was tension. A silent, unspoken pull between us that I was too scared to acknowledge but too weak to avoid. The tipping point came on a rainy Sunday afternoon. It had been pouring all day, and we were both stuck inside, bored and restless. Daniel suggested we play a card game, like we used to when we were kids. "You've got no chance," I teased, trying to keep things light. "We'll see about that," he shot back with a grin. As we played, the jokes and laughter started to feel different. Every touch of his hand when he passed me the cards felt intentional. Every glance lingered a little too long. My heart pounded, and it wasn't because of the game. At one point, I reached across the table to grab the deck, and our hands brushed. It was such a small moment, but it felt like electricity. I froze, and so did he. We locked eyes, and for a second, it felt like the whole world had stopped. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked quietly. I didn't know how to respond. Denying it felt like a lie, but admitting it, that would change everything. "I don't know what you're talking about," I whispered, pulling my hand back and standing up quickly. But Daniel wasn't letting it go. He followed me into the living room, his expression serious. "Don't do that," he said. "Don't pretend this isn't happening." "It's wrong," I blurted out. We can't feel this way." "Why not?" He challenged. "I know what we're supposed to be, but I can't help how I feel. And I don't think you can either." I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I felt like I was being pulled in two directions, and no matter which way I went, someone would get hurt. I told him we couldn't talk about it anymore, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. But the damage was already done. The lines had been blurred, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't unfeel what I felt. After that confrontation, things between Daniel and me became complicated. We never spoke directly about what had happened, but it was always there, simmering under the surface. Every glance, every word, every moment we spent together felt charged, like we were dancing around something we couldn't name. I tried to act normal, but normal didn't exist anymore. If I spent too much time with Daniel, I felt guilty, like I was walking a tightrope and could fall at any moment. If I avoided him, it felt like I was tearing a part of myself away. The hardest part? He wasn't making it easy to keep my distance. Daniel started finding excuses to spend more time together. He'd offer to help me with errands, suggest we watch a movie, or just hang out in my room. And the worst part was, I wanted him there. One evening, we were watching a movie in the living room. It was some romantic drama that neither of us was paying much attention to. The lights were dim, and the rain outside added a quiet backdrop to the scene. I don't even remember what started it, but at some point, I rested my head on Daniel's shoulder. It was such a small, innocent gesture, but it felt like crossing a line. He didn't move, didn't say a word, but I could feel the tension in the air. "You're making this really hard," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What am I making hard?" I asked, playing dumb, even though I knew exactly what he meant. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely between us. "Yes." "There is no us, Daniel," I said, pulling away. "There can't be." "Then why does it feel like there is?" I didn't have an answer. Instead, I stood up and mumbled something about being tired before heading to my room. I thought that would be the end of it for the night, but I was wrong. Later, there was a knock on my door. "Daniel, I'm really not in the mood." "It's important," he interrupted, his voice firm. I hesitated, then opened the door. He stepped inside, closing it behind him. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us heavy and uncomfortable. "I don't care what anyone else thinks," he said, looking directly at me. "I care about what you think, about what you feel." "I can't do this, Daniel," I said, my voice breaking. "It's not just about us. There are consequences, our family, our lives, everything we've built. It's not fair." "Fair doesn't matter," he said, stepping closer. "I'm not asking you to do anything right now. I'm just asking you to be honest. Do you feel it too?" His question hung in the air, demanding an answer I wasn't ready to give. Admitting the truth would mean everything would change. There would be no going back. But how long could I keep lying to myself and to him? I stood there, frozen, Daniel's question hanging between us like a weight I couldn't bear. My heart was racing, and every logical thought in my brain screamed at me to say no, to end this once and for all, but I couldn't. "Daniel," I started, my voice trembling. "I can't. I don't know." "That's not an answer," he said softly. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment I felt completely exposed. The truth was, I did feel it. Every moment we spent together, every glance, every word, it all felt different now. But how could I say that out loud? How could I admit something so wrong? Something that could destroy everything we knew? I can't do this, I whispered, looking away. You already are, he replied. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned away, desperate to put some space between us. But even as I did, I felt him take a step closer, closing the gap. Please, he said, his voice breaking. Just be honest with me. I need to know I'm not crazy. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that this was all in his head. But the words wouldn't come. The silence between us was deafening, and in that moment I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I don't know what I feel, I said finally, my voice barely audible. But whatever this is, it can't happen. It's not right. Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he nodded slowly, his expression a mix of heartbreak and understanding. I'm not going to push you, he said, but I'm here, and I think you know how I feel. With that, he left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The next few days were a blur. I threw myself into work, into anything that could keep me busy and distracted. But no matter what I did, I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. It didn't help that. He wasn't giving me much space. Daniel kept showing up in the little moments, bringing me coffee in the morning, casually sitting next to me at dinner, brushing against me as he passed by. Every interaction felt like a test. Like he was waiting for me to say something, to do something. And then there was the notebook. One evening, I found a small journal left on the coffee table. At first I thought it was mine, but when I opened it, I realized it belonged to Daniel. It was filled with sketches, notes, and little bits of poetry, things I never knew he did. But what caught my attention was a page near the back. It wasn't labeled, but as I read it, I felt my heart sink. It was about me. He had written about how he saw me not just as his sister, but as someone he admired, someone he couldn't stop thinking about. It was raw and honest, and it scared me. I knew I shouldn't have read it. I knew I should have put it down and walked away. But I couldn't. Every word felt like it was pulling me deeper into a place I wasn't sure I could escape from. That journal changed everything. It wasn't just feelings anymore, it was real. Written in ink, impossible to ignore. And the more I tried to fight it, the more it felt like I was losing control. I spent the entire night staring at that journal, my mind spinning in a million different directions. Part of me wanted to confront Daniel, to demand an explanation, but another part of me already knew exactly what he'd say. The words in that journal were everything I had been avoiding. They weren't just about admiration or sibling closeness. They were about longing, about love. And as much as I didn't want to admit it, they mirrored feelings I had been burying for weeks. The next morning, I avoided him completely. I couldn't face him, not after what I'd read. But Daniel wasn't someone you could avoid for long. By evening, he found me sitting in the backyard, staring blankly at the horizon. You've been quiet all day, he said, taking a seat next to me. I've just been thinking, I replied, trying to sound casual. About what? He asked, his tone cautious but curious. I hesitated, my fingers nervously picking at the edge of my sweater. I found your journal, I admitted, not looking at him. For a moment there was silence. Then I heard him exhale sharply. I didn't mean for you to see that, he said quietly. I know, I replied. But I did. And now I don't know what to do. Do about what? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. About us, I said finally, turning to look at him. His expression was a mix of fear and hope, and it broke my heart. I don't want to make things harder for you, he said. But I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel. I've tried, and it's impossible. I don't know if I can do this, Daniel, I said, my voice breaking. It's too much. It's too complicated. It doesn't have to be, he said, reaching for my hand. We don't have to figure everything out right now. I just need to know if you feel the same way. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell him that this was all a mistake, that we could go back to the way things were. But I couldn't lie anymore. Yes, I whispered, barely able to get the word out. But that doesn't mean it's right. That admission set off a chain reaction I couldn't stop. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and I danced around our feelings, never crossing a line, but never fully stepping away from it either. Every conversation, every shared moment felt like walking on a tightrope, one wrong move away from falling. And then came the night that changed everything. It was late, and the rest of the house was asleep. I was in the kitchen, unable to sleep, when Daniel walked in. "You're up late," he said, grabbing a glass of water. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, avoiding his gaze. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he set the glass down and turned to me. "We need to talk," he said. "About what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "About this," he said, gesturing between us. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. I need to know where we stand." "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know what to do, Daniel. Every part of me is telling me this is wrong, but I can't stop feeling what I feel." "Then stop fighting it," he said, stepping closer. "I can't," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's too much. It's too dangerous." "Then let me make it simple," he said, his voice steady. "Do you want me to walk away? Because if that's what you need, I'll do it. I'll walk away and never bring this up again. But if you want me to stay," Daniel's ultimatum left me speechless. He was offering me a way out, but was it what I wanted? I had to make a decision, and I knew that whatever I chose, there would be no going back. Daniel's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He stood there, waiting for my answer, his eyes locked on mine. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vise. This was it, the moment everything would change, one way or another. "Daniel," I began, my voice shaking. "I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how we can make this work without destroying everything." His expression softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "I'm not asking for everything to be figured out right now," he said. "I'm just asking you to choose. Do you want me to stay or not?" Tears welled up in my eyes. I wanted to say no, to tell him to walk away so we could pretend this never happened. But the truth was, I couldn't bear the thought of losing him. "I don't want you to go," I whispered. For a moment, he looked as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Then, without saying a word, he stepped closer and wrapped his arms around me. It wasn't romantic or suggestive. It was just comfort, safety, and understanding. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly, "one step at a time." The days that followed were a strange mix of relief and fear. Daniel and I became more careful around others, hyper-aware of how our interactions might be perceived. At the same time, we started finding moments where we could talk openly, without the weight of secrecy crushing us. But the peace didn't last long. Secrets have a way of coming to light, and ours was no exception. One evening, while Daniel and I were talking in hushed tones on the back porch, our older cousin Ellie walked out unexpectedly. We froze, both of us startled and unsure of how much she had overheard. "What's going on here?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "Nothing," I said quickly, too quickly. Ellie wasn't stupid. She looked at us both, her gaze sharp and probing. "You two have been acting weird for weeks," she said. "Don't tell me it's nothing." Daniel started to say something, but I cut him off. "We've just been spending more time together. That's all I said, trying to sound casual." "Yeah, and that's what's weird," Ellie replied. "You two were never this close before. What changed?" I felt panic rising in my chest. Ellie was the last person we wanted suspecting anything. She was blunt, observant, and had no problem calling people out. "Nothing changed," I said, forcing a laugh. "We're just getting along better these days." Ellie didn't look convinced, but she dropped the subject for the moment. Later that night, Daniel and I sat in my room, the tension between us palpable. "She knows something's up," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can handle it," Daniel replied. "How?" I asked, my voice breaking. "This is already hard enough without someone sniffing around. What if she figures it out? What if she tells someone?" "We'll figure it out," he said firmly. "But I'm not walking away just because things are getting difficult." His determination was comforting, but it didn't erase the fear gnawing at me. Ellie wasn't someone who let things go, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she started asking questions again. The walls were closing in, and I could feel the weight of our secret pressing down harder than ever. Daniel and I had made our choice, but could we survive the consequences?